Talking about games you like is incredibly easy. You just have to let the positivity flow forth, and it's easy enough to form your opinions from there because of how good a time you had. Similarly, games that you hate make for easy discussion, as something like getting stuck at a particular part gives you plenty of time to parse out why you hate it so much. It's when you land in the middle of that spectrum and find a game you're mixed on that forming your opinion gets hard. You have to weigh your options and determine if what the game gets right is enough to outweigh what it gets wrong. Depending on which side you land on, you also have to factor in just how much those bad parts drag down the good aspects, and similarly, how much the good parts elevate an unenjoyable experience. I've never played a game before that tested me like Slave 0X, both in its difficulty, but also in how I felt about it. Starting the game, I thought it was 2D character action at its finest. By the middle, I was ready to scrap all my effort because the game got horrible. Once I finally finished the game, I had no idea where I landed on it, because the game bounced back and forth from each side of the spectrum all the time. With any luck, by the end of this, I might finally realize where I land on this game, because it makes a great case for both seeing it through to the end and dropping it like an ugly baby. Developed by Poppyworks, whose catalog of games looks like a goddamn parody when you put Halloween Forever next to Devil Engine, Slave 0X is the prequel to the 1999 mech game Slave Zero. The two's connection feels tangential at best until the very last stages, and it feels much more like a standalone project that got hurriedly changed into being a Slave Zero project. Why would you do that? I'm not very sure, but I can be certain it's not for what some of the Steam forum posts are claiming the reason is, which is that they're trying to cash in on the Slave Zero brand. If I'm a developer looking to try to cash in on a franchise, buddy, I'm not picking a Dreamcast game, I'll tell you that much. The game puts you in the bioarmor of Sho, a guardian who fights back against an oppressive government led by the Sovkhan, a Lovecraftian horror in man's clothing who has taken control of the various megacities that make up the hellish world you find yourself in. That bioarmor you wear is named X, a slave unit that was fished out of the trash and is the Guardian's last hope to fight back. Sho ends up stealing X from the Guardians in order to seek revenge against the Sovkhan, which X is on board with as they also want to murder the Sovkhan. These two nutcases are the exact sort of thing the other needs to make their situation way worse. You find out pretty quickly that there's a pecking order, and you are at the bottom, so from the slums to the skyscrapers, you're off to go make a difference. The immediate eye-catching feature of this game are the graphics, merging pixel art with 3D backgrounds like only a Dreamcast port of KOF 99 could. The sprite work on this game is absolutely outstanding. Animations in this game are fluid, smooth, and detailed both on designs and animations, stylized with out-of-proportion bodies and accessories that leave you marveling at every character design. Sho himself is rocking an incredible design, a bold red color with flowing white hair that bends and flows in tons of different ways depending on the attack, along with the sword that's as long as you are. And I'd say that only games like Strider and Shinobi give you such a strikingly cool main character without making the design cluttered or obscuring screen real estate. Attack animations as well are incredibly well done, and give every attack a feeling of strength from how large the hitboxes can be. From basic sword swings to helm splitters, charged punches, and towers of flesh and bone. This design brilliance extends to the enemies as well, with each one of them instantly recognizable for their purpose at a glance. The basic enemies are much smaller and less threatening, the hammer guys are wider and much bulkier, and the lancers are taller and thinner. These two especially contrast great against the waves of smaller guys, which let you pick them out of a lineup fast and get to slashing even faster. Other enemies, like mini-bosses, also keep up this level of style and function. Seeing these giant generals with capes covering their entire bodies, with just the hilt of a sword to let you know to be on the lookout, or these disgusting fleshy dogs that pounce all around the screen. That is to say nothing of the backgrounds, which look straight out of a PlayStation game. Usually littered with graffiti and ads that mean even if the palette is predominantly gray and brown, it never feels dull. It makes areas like the city feel extremely lived in and run down, while contrasting areas like the dance palace that are lavish, gold-plated, and meant for anybody but you. Show's default red palette always stands out perfectly against these backgrounds, meaning that, at least to start, you never get lost in the action. The game never skimps out on detail, and the world feels so realized as a result. Later levels becoming more twisted as you dive deeper in and see how flesh and machine are being merged into one unrecognizable mass. Oh, not like you, Show and X, you're doing it cool. Keep up the good work. The game's greatest achievement in this regard is when you go to the third boss, Uriel's level. It starts out normal until you take an elevator down to where he's being kept, in the heart of a nuclear reactor. Enemies try to fight you at first, but eventually start running away from something or dropping out of the sky dead. The lights are flickering on and off as you walk through total darkness, jammers keeping you from your support team, until you reach the end.
You didn't heed my warning, but I forgive you, Guardian. I forgive you! It's so bright. Oh, come back! Come back!
The whole level takes place inside of a combination nuclear reactor and science lab, where you take on these grotesque artificial angels who are what's left of humans that have come into contact with dark matter. Their mutilated and warped bodies, muscles visible, and features distorted really give this level a feeling of horror, one that the entire game keeps up but is especially prominent in level 3. It's the game's crowning achievement in terms of atmosphere, and feels like no other hack and slash I've ever played. Whatever you want to say about the game, the graphical style and look is an unwavering part of the positives column and will stay that way forever. The column opposite the positives starts filling up when you talk about the gameplay. Despite the game obviously being a side-scrolling beat-em-up, the controls aren't formatted that way. Instead of a simple light, heavy, and special attack out of something like Double Dragon or Shredder's Revenge, Slave Zero takes way more inspiration from Devil May Cry, and especially Guilty Gear. Don't mistake that for the game being easy to learn. It clearly doesn't want to be learned. Instead of a tutorial or combo trials to help you learn how to play, you get about a dozen pages of what moves you have and how they work. As far as ways to teach the player, this is as bad as it comes, and will leave you oblivious to half of what you can do when the game starts. Try piloting a jumbo jet with just the manual. It takes being in the field to get the experience you need. Your main moves are a light and heavy swing that can be comboed together, as well as modified depending on the direction you hold, for launchers, helm splitters, dash slices, and the ground spike. Pressing X and Y while holding a direction will activate an EX move, which at the cost of some special meter give you a beefed up normal move with added properties, like the launcher hitting multiple times, or the air grab now exploding on impact. Fill it up all the way and you unlock Fatal Sync. It's your Devil Trigger, your Ripper Mode, your Pumpkin King. You get EX moves for free, deal way more damage, and heal with every hit. All of these move options, and yet it still doesn't feel like you have much to do. Those basic moves I mentioned are all you get. No upgrades or new moves along the way. All you get is stuff like health upgrades, meter speed increases, and sub-weapons from... I thought this was outlawed. It's also where you can get new skins, which is where I spent my money. You can make the game unplayable! What an unlock! Combat itself does feel good. The game gives you great feedback when you're tearing through people, and there are situations when the game is a lot of fun. Anytime you're pitted against a larger enemy like the generals, or the souped-up versions of the normal grunts and lancers, the game becomes really good. Timing your dodges to dance around the enemy, peppering them with hits while staying back when you're outmatched, finally breaking their shield and getting to combo them, it feels really good. The problem is that this isn't a majority of gameplay. Instead, that's tackling waves upon waves of grunts coming to take a swing. These portions, though, can also be great fun. If you're able to stay in control of combat, you get the chance to juggle loads of enemies, weaving between them and clearing whole rooms in an instant. Fall out of control for a second, though, and the game shows no mercy. Seeing all these enemies on screen at once is cool at first, but then you have so many that they overlap. And when they do, they'll often hide each other's attack animations by accident. All of those great animations begin melding together into one giant blob, and you're completely overwhelmed with so much visual information that you can't see where attacks are coming from. Getting hit over and over again from attacks that you can't see is awful, and the bigger the crowds, the worse the problem. Show also gets knocked around way too much. You get stunned really easily, and after a few attacks, you're launched across the screen and are left helpless. That's okay, you can just bounce back, right? No, because the game doesn't have a quick recover after getting hit. The enemies are just as capable of juggling you as you are of juggling them. And in a game as fast as this one, the feeling of losing control is not appreciated. You have your burst, which is a get-off-me tool and combo reset that can be used to get out of an enemy's combo, but you only have one with a fairly long recharge time. If you use it and then get hit again, you're not seeing the ground for a really long time. Giving this ability to basic grunts was a huge mistake, and gets much worse when stuck between multiple big enemies. Look at how a game like Double Dragon Gaiden does it. Sure, you can get stunned really easily, but your tag-out gauge means that you always have an option to get away. Here, you have nothing like that. The game tries to offset this by including a training option for you to prepare, but it only really prepares you for fighting singular unmoving enemies in a featureless room. This doesn't help nearly as much as a proper tutorial because it doesn't prepare you for a lion's share of the game's gameplay. It's good for fighting those singular tough enemies, but worthless in crowds, where a flashy wombo combo doesn't matter nearly as much as crowd control. That limited moveset of yours doesn't feel suited for fighting large clusters of enemies. It's meant for small groups and one-on-one fights. But when you get bum-rushed, you crumble. And the game's enemy number gets especially annoying when powered-up grunts become the norm, as their machine gun attacks, which can come in from off-screen, only serve to open you up to get torn apart. The game feels like it was designed for Sho to have loads more moves he just doesn't have. You have a launcher, but nothing to really do in the air. You get a Roman cancel a la Guilty Gear, but what are you using it for? The idea of having a character control like a fighting game character is great, but that doesn't mean it'll work properly in every scenario. Is it any wonder why the best parts of the game are when you're having one-on-one fights? If the game had a second option to deal with crowds like this, aside from the burst or an EX move or sub-weapons, which I routinely forgot existed for how little they did, heck, even an air recovery, it might be fine. But as it is, it doesn't always feel like the game knows how many enemies it makes you deal with. Strangely, I often found the massive crowds to be more manageable when the game put another layer on top of it. In the first level, one of the sections ends out with a huge wave of grunts, as well as dropping bombs at random from a large cluster above you. The threat of the bombs kept me constantly moving, which meant I was less likely to get hit, not just by them, but also the enemies. And this made it a lot more fun than the other standard grunt rushes. Similarly, in the second stage, you're constantly under fire from a sniper who's trying to pop your head like a balloon, shown off in-game as a reticle appearing on the screen for a few seconds before damaging anybody who stays inside of it. Like before, the incentive to stay on the move means enemies have a much harder time hitting you. This only really works in these sections too, because later on when these sorts of sections come up, the areas you're supposed to dodge to are just filled with more enemies. The enemy design as well can occasionally be really interesting, like these flesh sacks you find in level 3. If you kill them normally, they'll explode into these annoying worms that slide under a lot of your attacks. requiring you to take the time to kill them before focusing back on bigger threats. If you kill the sack boys with a charged attack, or slam them out of the air though, you'll be able to pop them without spawning any worms. And more enemy design like this, where you have to put thought into how to deal with them, along with a decreasing in the size of waves you fight, would have been a godsend. Unfortunately, like I said, the game does crap itself around level 4 when more of its bad habits begin to show up. Enemy waves and their frequency reach a critical mass, as you're trapped in fights with enemies that always take one too many combos to kill, which leaves these sections dragging on forever. With your limited move pool, you'll often find that you run out of combos that you haven't repeated dozens of times before, and the realization sets in that the game is getting kind of dull. Stuck in one place for an extended period of time as you spin your wheels, doing the same combos over and over and over, with no room for expression. It's in these sections that the game betrays its own well-established distinction for show from the backgrounds by putting bullshit in front of you to help obscure your vision. You have enough trouble just dealing with the enemies on the same plane as you, but then you throw a bunch more in front of you that are all black and obscure everything? Come on, that's just not fair. The game also gets extremely poor with checkpoints around this point, and puts massive gulfs between them. Getting to a really tough fight before a checkpoint, only to be sent back to the beginning of the level, feels miserable. And I've mentioned the powered up grunts and spear enemies, but what about the hammer enemies? You know what this game really doesn't need for the enemies? Super armor. 0 frames of startup on extremely strong moves make it so fighting these guys is always a massive hassle. And if it's not just one-on-one and more guys show up, just pack it in, you pretty much already lost. Every single one of these problems is present in this Undertale-ass hallway. Seriously, check out the logos on the windows, it's meant to be the same hallway you fight Sans in. A massive wave of enemies at the end of a series of massive waves, with pillars obscuring your views, and a big hammer guy to make you want to quit the game. And this part almost made me. I had to take a step back and start begging the devs for help. I wanted to know if they had a big brother they could send to beat the level for me. I was fucking done. Now, I do hate fighting the hammer guys, and would rather see them dragged out of the game in handcuffs. But there is a secret to fighting them. And in encounters where you can fight just them and maybe a few grunts, it's actually not that bad. Bait out the hammer attacks because it has a long cooldown, dodge into the dash grab instead of away from it, never ever attack unless you know it's safe. Learning enemies like this can be fun. The game just doesn't give you enough opportunities to put what you learn to good use. For as much as I've dogged on the latter half of the game, there are still plenty of fun sections. Like this fight against a powered-up hammer and spear guy. Ornstein, Schmo, love your work in Dark Souls. Really not appreciating you right now. When you only have 2 of these guys to deal with, it gets so much more manageable. And the challenge of taking on 2 super hard enemies at once is allowed to be fun since you're not babysitting an entire room of crazed toddlers. It's not visually cluttered, you get so much more room to work with, so much less information you need to take in. Their attack patterns are still difficult to avoid, but when you do avoid them, it feels great. And you have room to avoid too. You don't have to go start a new fight in the middle of this much bigger, much more important fight. You get more chances to divide aggro. You can take on the spear guy first since he has less health, and will be more dangerous in the long run since you have more experience fighting the big hammer guy. It's just the game at its best, and it's rarely like this. You know what are exactly like these and a massive highlight of the game? The bosses. The boss fights in this game are exceptionally fun in comparison to the rest of the game. These are almost always one-on-one fights against extremely strong enemies. And as I've described, the game excels in such a scenario. The only fight that doesn't allow this format is, unfortunately, Uriel, who you only run away from and fight groups of enemies between chase sections. For a boss as visually striking as this one, I would have loved to fight him. And before you say they couldn't have had a sprite fighting a model, the very next boss fight has that exact thing. The first boss fight is against the Iron General Hercules Thorman. And while it's a bit basic, he's still extremely dangerous, since his attacks are simple to dodge, but still hit like a truck. He's the right amount of manageable, but threatening, that makes it feel like an achievement to overcome him. I also love how much character can be shown off in his fight, like his transition to the second phase being him getting so frustrated that he hasn't killed you yet, that he throws a temper tantrum and destroys the platform you're standing on. Every one of the bosses has a really enjoyable personality, but Thorman's is clearly the best. He's a loud, brash, patriotic pig who trash talks you the entire way up to his fight. The other bosses are good, but Thorman clearly has the most charisma. They also all have some Class A voiceover to accompany all of this, with Griffin Burns, Elizabeth Maxwell, Sungwon Cho, and Maria Genote, among many others turning in great performances. My favorite, though, is Jameson Price as the Sovcon, simply because poor Mr. Price has been ruined in my mind, as whenever I recognize his voice, I remember he was General Jelly Jiggler in Bo-Bo-Bo-Bo-Bo-Bo-Bo.
It was the only answer. My suffering showed me the truth.
Super Fist of the Wobble Wobble! Wrapping paper! Worked pretty well.
Level 2's boss, Enyo, is a huge step up in terms of difficulty, but thankfully the manageability increases in kind, giving you lots more to focus on with her flurry of projectiles, while also giving you enough time to get your hits in. As the fight goes on, she even takes you for a ride and busts out some Marvel vs. Capcom staples like Doctor Doom's hidden missiles and Iron Man's proton cannon. Oh, thank f*** she doesn't play Magneto. Baiting her into unsafe moves is essential to try to beat her, which only gets easier when you realize that air combos keep her stun going for a lot longer than ground combos. Out of the standard boss fights, Enyo was probably my favorite. And if you were curious about what she would look like on the Quake engine, you can also check out Episode Enyo, an official total conversion of Quake made to promote Slave Zero X, making this Quake mod a prequel to this prequel. Alright, let me just make sure I got this straight. So the official release order of the Slave Zero games is 1996, 2024, 1999. The next boss, Regent, is a puppet master, meaning you don't fight him directly, but rather fight an incomplete slave unit, much closer to the size they'd become in the original Slave Zero. It's a bit of a gimmick fight, but it's a good gimmick at the same time. It's nothing you wouldn't expect from a fight like this, but it executes a basic idea rather well. The spectacle of fighting something this distinctive and big is enough for me to enjoy the fight, so it gets a pass despite not being very technically deep. Technically deep is what comes next in the fight with Adavaka. This is your Virgil for the game, and is the guardian your master initially chose to inherit X. Gotta say, great intuition from the master on this one. He beat me like a rented mule. Adavaka is playing Brawl Meta Knight, and you're playing Dead. He's a faster and stronger version of you. There's an unwinnable fight against him at the start of the game, and they don't tone him down for this fight. If your parrying and dodges aren't perfect, he will ruin you. You're going to learn the boss the way the game wants you to, or lose. You need to understand how to control the neutral space, what approach opportunities you have, what attacks you can punish him on, what moves you can bait out from him. Pretty soon you'll realize this isn't a hack and slash boss, it's a fighting game. Applying the lessons from that genre to this fight are your key to victory. Sticking close to the boss is exactly what he wants. That's where he's at his best. Force him out of his comfort zone and into yours. Use your items to punish his approach by making him walk into damage. Only attack him when it's safe for you to do so, and spend the rest of the time messing up his positioning. This isn't easy, especially in Phase 2 when lightning starts to rain down almost constantly. But every death is a chance to see a part of his kit, and learn how to counter it. His uppercut is really easily punished. You can parry his grabs. Dashes are usually a signal that he's going for the grab. If he jumps, look out for the disjointed and awkward down slash. Even with all of that though, I won't act like this isn't tough. The fight is absurdly difficult. But at the same time, it didn't take me nearly as long as any of the encounters with a heavy hammer enemy. It was fun to learn, while also rewarding you for the learning you could do with quicker and quicker armor breaks. The fight isn't just a climax of the game testing your skill. It's also a bittersweet note to end on, since Sho has to kill the very person he started his journey with the intent of avenging. You can feel the doubt in Sho knowing that he has to fight somebody who he loves, and who was picked over him as a better candidate to be a guardian than he was. The game up until this point, though, has been about Sho finding the qualities that he needs to be a good guardian. But he didn't do it alone. It was alongside X's struggle, and through their combined efforts, they've become one whole, better person. I feel bad that all this talk about gameplay has largely come at the consequence of ignoring the story, but it's another part of the game that I would firmly place in the positives. Tying into the cyberpunk theming of the whole thing, there are extremely overt themes of anarchism and transhumanism. What with the main characters being emotionally unstable terrorists killing government officials and all. There's also a heavy focus on autonomy, with X's struggles with her own place in the world, and how she copes with being an outmoded machine. I love the additional snippets of lore you can get by killing hidden enemies, like finding out that General Thorman wasn't born in America and doesn't even really understand what America's messaging was. He's just using the jingoistic symbolism as a shortcut to earn approval. There's a really strong message about how idiots will use old-world symbolism to try and borrow credibility they don't have. On the Sho side of the equation, though, we get the story of him and Itsamu, or Adavaka from before he died. And the two are madly and gay with each other. That's not derogatory, I mean the game is intensely, unabashedly gay all the time, and it is so fucking cute. Sho and Itsamu are so goddamn adorable together. They do a great job of establishing these two's relationship and showing that they have a bond that goes deeper than any other. So when Itsamu does die, it makes perfect sense that Sho would want to burn the whole world down. I got so excited every time I got to see these two in a cutscene together because they're just so much fun. You cannot own a top this cropped and have any interest in the secrets of the vagina. It's just impossible. There are also great moments woven into the gameplay to reflect the story. Like Sho being able to tell when the Regent is using an AI voice to sound like his master because he messes up and says, "I believe in you, Sho." Sho's master has no faith in him, and it's a really funny joke. Sho and X are briefly turned against each other in Regent's level, which results in this cool fight in a lake against Shadow Shos, before the two reconnect and become stronger, accompanied by some beautiful artwork. Now, if Adavaka had been the final fight and Sho and X went on to fight the Sovkhan and obviously lose since it's a prequel, that would have been one thing. But the final boss, who is what if Dracula ruled over SNK instead of Transylvania, just sucks. Whatever fairness you could say was in the last fight is not present here because it's just learning a bunch of new moves which are all screen-filling giant projectiles which you have no way to avoid. Sometimes literally, I don't think you can avoid half these moves. At the same time though, they deal deceptively low damage, which means you're just getting pinballed around the stage with nothing really happening. You're still gonna beat the Sovkhan, it's just gonna be a long, frustrating process. The only highlight of the fight is the giant ball with an evil skull face. I didn't recognize it as deadly until the skull was added. There's a second phase as well, but it's even more style over substance than the Regent fight. I legit beat him by accident. I didn't realize I had won at first. It was that sudden. At least it does end out satisfyingly by turning my least favorite action game trope on its head. I hate when a villain isn't upset about losing. When you finally take them down and they start eyeing up the poem book, ready to read off a few bars, I always roll my eyes. I just knocked your dick in the dirt. Care! Sovkhan gets it right. You beat him and he doesn't even wait to start begging for his life.
Blood. Suffering. Humanity. You weren't supposed to touch me. You made it all wrong. Somebody help me!
The game ends out with the Sovkhan escaping, since he kinda has to, as Sho and X begin breaking down due to the dark matter they've been exposed to. But escape with the final slave unit that you use in the original Slave Zero. A fine ending, though the ambiguity does make me wonder if they'll try for a sequel. So, at the end, having laid out everything I feel about the game, where do my feelings land? Well, it's still hard to say. As it is, I feel like the game does do a lot of stuff really well. I think presentation-wise, it's unparalleled as one of the best pixel art 3D mixtures you can play. I think the music, which I wish I had more of a chance to cover, is fantastic. The story is a joy, and when the game is working at 100%, it's a blast. The problem is that 100% is only around 50% of the actual game. You spend far too much time in long, boring fights that get frustrating and unfair for me to recommend this with full confidence. At the same time, I feel like a lot of the game's challenge can be overcome with proper learning and pattern recognition. But then other challenges come down to dumb luck. The word struggle comes to mind whenever I think about Slave Zero X. I struggled to learn the combos and how to make moves flow together naturally. I struggled against certain enemies that tested what was fair to expect from the player. I even struggled to find a reason to keep playing at points. Ultimately, I think my respect for the artistic vision and inspired concepts of the game are enough to make me say I did enjoy my time. There are very, very rough patches that I wouldn't fault anybody at tapping out at, especially with how often they feel like shots below the belt. It does still earn a very tentative stamp of approval from me, because I do see so much of what the game is trying to do, and hope that Poppy Softworks gets the chance to make another similar game, and take the failings of this one into account when making it. They deserve a shot to refine and rework this game, because it very much is a rough diamond. Polish off the debris and cut it into the right shape, and it'll shine.